Hey, welcome back to Business 101, Introduction to Business, and welcome to Module 7. The topic of Module 7 is operations. Operations is actually the production of goods and services. How does that actually get done? What are the nuances? What are the considerations? What's the planning that goes into it? And how do organizations make sure they're able to deliver the products and services to customers in a way that customers will be expecting and will be delighted with? In this first lecture, we look at the topic of what is operations? And of course, what are some of the things we have to consider as we begin this very first exploration at the topic of operations and production? Well, as you can see here, as we answer the question, what's operations to begin with? It's a synonym for production, and therefore the textbook describes it as all the activities involved in making products, either goods or services for customers. And here, at our first distinction between services and goods, will help us to understand the differentiation as well as the similarities depending on what your end product is. So with service operations, we refer to all the activities producing intangible and tangible products such as entertainment, transportation, education, all those kinds of services. We distinguish that from goods operations or goods production. You see the last bullet point, all activities producing tangible products such as, well, radios, newspapers, buses, textbooks, anything you can lay your hands on. Now, while it may seem initially, well, a bit artificial to say, well, is there really a huge difference between services and goods? I think we'll see as we continue on in subsequent lectures in this module that it really is helpful to distinguish the operations producing goods as well as the operations producing services. So if we continue to look at this, we reproduce this figure 7.1 from your textbook just to show the differences, first of all, in employment numbers for service production versus goods production. And of course, you see here from 2004 to 2016 here in the United States, in millions of workers, the vast difference in employment between U.S. folks employed in services versus folks involved in the production of goods. You can see there, right, that there's enormous disparity and that we really have become, at least in terms of employment, a services economy rather than a goods production economy. And you see the little sidebar there, I think, which is interesting in the blue on the right. Although employment among both U.S. goods producers and services has flattened out in recent years, earlier growth in the services industries has risen to over 124 million jobs, about 90% of the total. Clearly, most people are working in services rather than in goods production. And it has been that way, well, for quite a little bit here in the United States. Now, that's just simply in terms of employment. When we look at contribution to gross domestic product, it's a little bit of a different story. Certainly, services contribute more in terms of billions of dollars towards the value of gross domestic product versus the production of goods. You see the two lines on figure 7.2 reproduced from your textbook. But notice that although there's more contribution of GDP to GDP from services rather than the production and manufacture of goods, notice the comment above in the blue. Although the service sector GDP is now about twice that of the goods producing sector, so in terms of GDP contribution, services contribute about twice as much rather than goods. However, goods producers only use 11% of the workforce to generate about a third of the country's GDP. So think about that for a moment. The chart you are looking at before you is in billions of dollars in terms of the relative contribution of the services sector to U.S. gross domestic product, overall production, relative to the contribution that goods production makes to overall gross domestic product. However, that 1/3 of the country's GDP is done with only 11% of the U.S. workforce. Yes, there are far fewer employees in the U.S. working in goods production, but they're far more efficient in terms of production and contribution to U.S. gross domestic product output. What does this all mean to us today as we consider these charts and these figures and facts as we begin our exploration of the topic of operations or production of services versus goods? Well, if we understand these figures correctly, they seem to suggest that, well, for most of us, we will spend some time in our career in a service industry. And that can range from a whole set of different things, everything from, well, education, like what I do for you, to customer service, to banking, to all sorts of different service production industries and roles in the United States. You can see from the previous chart just how much employment is involved in the service sector here in the United States. However, what we take away from the second chart is that even though there are far fewer employees employed in goods production here in the United States, nevertheless, they are far more efficient and their contribution outsizes, in a sense, and outweighs the individual contribution to gross domestic product of service employees. And so it's vital, it's important, even though it's common and typical nowadays to say in newspapers and the media that we've become a service economy rather than a manufacturing economy here in the United States. It's a matter of degree. It's not a matter of black and white. The contribution of goods production here in the United States is still significant and necessary and important and required for the U.S. economy to function properly. So we can't discount it. Even as we continue on in later videos in this module number 7 to consider the nuances and the differences between producing services versus producing goods, both are important and we should pay attention to both. They're both necessary here in the United States and to our economy. So that's how we should look at both these distinctions as we move forward in module 7. I hope that's helpful as we get started looking at our exploration of the topic of operations. We'll see you in the next lecture.